Yeah. All right. Welcome to Virtual Beers with Counter Apologist. Today we are going to be discussing the logical problem of evil, and I have two people with me that I am extraordinarily happy to have here, guys I've been following for quite some time. I have Jonathan Pearce, the Tippling Philosopher, and Justin Schieber from Reasonable Doubts. If you guys want to introduce yourselves.
One correction already. You said we're going to be discussing the logical problem, and that's not the case. Um,
Crap.
uh, no, we were discussing prior to this airing about the logical problem. So my name is Justin Schieber. I was raised a believing Christian until roughly my mid-teens, when I was forced to take up arms as the good Christian soldier against my growing doubts. But clearly I lost that battle, and now I co-host a podcast called The Reasonable Doubts, and yeah, I argue for godlessness. So
Yay, godlessness.
Well, we're all very glad about that.
Absolutely. My name's Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I am a tippling philosopher. I blog at www.skepticinc.com/tippling. I was raised in an apathetic household where I was allowed to kind of make up my own mind, which is fairly nice. So over a number of years, I sort of got more and more interested in debating stuff, and more recently in the last decade in philosophy, and I've written sort of 3 books, working on loads of projects, and just love the philosophy of religion. It floats my boat. So there you go.
Awesome. All right. So to quickly cover what we're going to talk about today, I already made a mistake. So what we're not going to discuss is what I said in the logical problem of evil. And so the logical problem of evil basically states that there is a logical contradiction between stating that the God of classical theism exists and that evil exists. And while there has been some arguments put out fairly recently that challenge the typical answers that we see to the logical problem of evil, um, we're going to avoid talking about it largely because you can avoid the problem by positing mere possibility, and possibility comes very, very cheaply. So what we're going to discuss is the evidential problem of evil. And so what we'd like to do is we'll go through the argument, and what we're going to discuss is the problems with the responses to the evidential problem, because there are responses that theists have, but the issue is, at least for us atheists, is that they're not very convincing. And I'd like to make an analogy here with, if you remember the presidential election in 1992 with Bill Clinton, as a candidate, he said he never smoked marijuana. And then eventually in the campaign, a picture came out of him in college with a joint in his mouth. And to square the circle, he said, well, I never inhaled. And while that possibility exists that he never inhaled, so he never smoked marijuana, it's not really believable. And so that's what we think the answers to the evidential problem of evil are like, and it's our job to kind of present why.
I guess
Exactly.
what you're saying is that God probably smoked pot. Is this the inference we're supposed to be making here?
That would explain so much about the world we live in,
Absolutely.
or at least the Video Music
Um,
Awards.
so,
And the
so
Holy Spirit, by
Right.
default, the Holy Spirit will be taking on
That's what he is. He's like a cloud of
inhalation.
weed smoke.
it's purple haze. All right.
But
um,
just to cover for those who maybe are listening who aren't so conversant in these arguments, the logical problem of evil basically says, do you know what? There's a lot of suffering in the world, but it's not gratuitous, and it might be that God has a reason for it. We just don't know what it is, but it's not logical contradiction that there is evil and there's God. There could be a greater good or something. And so theists will put out a defense. So that a defense is something that is a mere possibility, as John rightly said, and it gets a bit sort of abstract and a bit sort of, well, you're talking about possibilities and anything could happen. But as you said, today is about evidence and what is more plausible and more probable.
right. So where the logical problem is a deductive problem, it's saying that no instance of evil whatsoever can be logically squared with the existence of God. The evidential problem makes the much more humbler claim that the existence of evil counts as evidence against the existence of God. So the argument most famously was presented by William Rowe, and he has a few different versions of the argument, and I kind of have my own Rowe style argument that I like to defend, and it goes like this. Premise 1: many evils or instances of suffering seem gratuitous. So we simply can't find out. We can't conceive of how the existence of many of these evils, of these many particular evils, are logically necessary for some greater good to obtain, right? Premise 2 would be probably some evils are gratuitous. Now this infers from premise 1. It kind of assumes that we think that we're in a decent position to make this kind of probabilistic inference. Premise 3 is if God exists, God would not permit any gratuitous evils whatsoever. Gratuitous evils or sufferings or what have you. Now this is a theological premise, right? So this is going to be contingent upon whether or not your conception of God is this way. So this third premise is essentially saying, if God exists, God would prevent the occurrence of any instance of evil or instance of suffering that is not logically necessary for achieving some greater good. And then the conclusion we reach after those three is that probably God does not exist, but this is a kind of all things being equal, right? So if we start at God being 0.5, then it should lower the probability of God once you take on board the evidence of the existence of instances of apparently gratuitous suffering and evil. Because the argument grants outright that God might have reasons to permit some evils for the occurrence of some greater good, or to avoid some bad or worse evil. And yeah, so that's the argument in a nutshell.
I guess, Justin, in a way, it's a case of the probability of divine hiddenness, isn't it? So that, yes, there could be a reason why all this suffering exists, and God could have a good reason, but what's the probability that God isn't communicating that to us? Because as far as I know, I'm not being explicitly communicated any reason why the suffering happens. There may be some interpretations of certain, books in the Old Testament and New that you can infer that there is a reason, but it's not particularly explicit. So it's what are the chances of the reasons remaining hidden? And I wrote a book called The Little Book of Unholy Questions, and one of the questions I wrote to God was, if I had a child who was stomping on the flowers outside my house, and the child came in, and I absolutely bollocked my child. I tore strips off it. I punished it for days on end. I was really, really draconian to the child, but I never told that child why I was punishing it. That seems to be inherently immoral, and it seems really problematic. That I mean, what's the use of me punishing a child if I'm not going to tell him why I'm punishing him, so
right.
that it has any kind of corrective use?
You bring up a very good point. So you can kind of draw an analogy, which I mean, theists they don't shy away from drawing the analogy of a parent to a child in talking about the relationship between God and man, right? Now you're absolutely right. Let's say it's easy to imagine instances where our parents would subject us to physical pain or suffering in order to acquire some greater good, right? So so vaccinations, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Right.
Vaccinations, right? To avoid the onset of some disease later in life. That seems clearly a perfectly justifiable instance of suffering to impose upon your child. And now the issue here is, of course, is that typically those kinds of things happen at an age where the parent really isn't able to communicate to their child the reasons for their suffering. And so it's not really a blameworthy thing. The parent isn't at blame for this, right? Because it's totally understandable. The child won't be able to even understand what the parent is saying. Presumably he's young enough or too young. Now,
but
of course,
to interrupt just for a second, is
yeah.
The parent would at least say, do you know what? There is a reason, even if you can't understand it. This was actually going to be good for you, and I'm not even sure that is particularly explicit from God or the Bible. But
right. No, I'm actually taking your point and using it as a further argument against the existence of God. So you could say that let's take this analogy seriously. If the parent had the ability and the child had the ability to understand, if the parent had the ability to communicate to the child the reasons for his suffering, and the child had the ability to understand, so the potential for that communication was there, and yet that parent still didn't communicate those reasons, then that, at the very least, is evidence against the lovingness of that parent. Because any parent that would love their child and would recognize that there are some things that need to happen in order for some greater good, that parent would be immanent in that child's life and just constantly remind them that they love them and give them the reasons for, and if the child can't understand those reasons, then they should constantly be with that child and guiding him through that painful process. But so this is actually an argument against the existence of God, or the existence of a loving God, right?
Right. Now, I guess the biggest thing is that, and so you would expect something along those lines of, like, there are better reasons, whereas, say, in the Bible, you'll get things of, well, don't question God, or God's ways are mysterious, who can divine his ways, etc., etc. That's not an answer. That's not even remotely saying that there even is one.
Right. No, the book of Job is just challenging how dare you ask the question in the first place.
Which is ridiculous, because if you analogize that back to the child, that's saying that child's just been beaten for 3 days or whatever. I've given that child cancer for jumping on my flowers, and the child's just going, why are you doing this? And then I hit him again for asking why I'm hitting him or giving him cancer. I mean, it's just completely.
It is. It's channeling the Carlin routine, but he loves you. So,
brackets, I love you.
Yeah. I think so. This is kind of touching on the. I guess this is touching on what's known as the skeptical theism response to the evidential problem of evil, and that is that there is a reason, but we don't know what it is. I guess that's sort of implied by this whole.
Well, one thing I would want to say before we go down that discussion, because that's a much meatier discussion that can take quite an amount of time, is that in response to the evidential problem of evil, there are at least 4 potential responses, potential avenues for the theist to go down, right? So for one, they could say, they could reject that God, or that their belief in God has these triomny properties that are being assumed in this argument, right? They could say, well, my God isn't, he's not all powerful. He's just more powerful than anybody else, right?
It was open theism, I think, is what that's called, or they deny certain aspects of omniscience, so that he can't really know the future actions of free creatures, or something along those lines.
That's what open theism is, an ignorance of the future.
Which is actually an answer. It is an answer. Open theism is an answer to the problem of evil. I mean, that's why it was conceived.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it. I mean, let's not skirt around the issue that has some biblical support. Also, if we
much
go
to the chagrin of many Christians.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least if you assume that the Hebrew Bible, that the stories in there are pretty representative of God, then clearly God doesn't know everything, right? Now, so some of these different responses are, that as I just said, you could deny that God has the particular attributes being assumed here. Another way is to say that the conclusion, which is that all things being equal, that this should lower the probability of God, the theist, of course, is going to say, well, not all things are equal, right? So I have all these independent arguments over here that I can utilize to show that, yeah, sure, the evidential problem of evil reduces the probability. It's evidence against the existence of God, but these other arguments over here more than make up for that probabilistic deficit. And so your
I think
posterior...
that's a problem. Yeah, because it's a Bayesian analysis here. So you're messing around with other arguments which affect it, and then it becomes. I mean, can you just take the evidential problem on its own?
No, you can't.
No, exactly.
You'd be denying the whole thing, because in order to get your posterior probability, right, your final conclusion about your probability of your hypothesis, you need to not just take into consideration one of the arguments. You need to take into consideration the weight of all the arguments you can.
Knowledge, isn't it? Everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the things, I guess, that always struck me here was, I think even in his book Reasonable Faith, William Lane Craig even admits at one point that we could consider the evidential problem of evil to be evidence against God, so that, as you had said, if we had considered all things 50-50, it would reduce the probability of God's existence.
Right.
And he has a little graphic of like a scale, and he has the problem of evil on one end, and he has all the other arguments on the other end, kind of overpowering the evidence against God. And so
he admits that's a thorn in the side for Christians, doesn't he? He fully admits that it's the biggest issue for your rational Christian. But the problem is with someone like Craig, of course, is the really heavy reliance on the personal experience of the Holy Spirit. And he says basically there is no evidence in the universe that can sway my belief, because I have this inner witness. So
so I think it might be the case that so I think that Craig's position on the evidential problem of evil is something akin to the skeptical theist response, which we'll get to earlier. But I think probably what you were reading, John, and I think he also says this in his debates, is that even if it was evidence, right? He's giving a kind of conditional thing here. This is even if it was evidence against the existence of God, it shouldn't matter necessarily, because there's all these other arguments that we shouldn't be ignoring, right?
And the one thing that I always really like to point out there is, and especially for almost all of those other arguments that he likes to bring up, or any apologist likes to bring up, is that not a single one of them is anywhere even remotely conclusive. Like, I don't think you can show that something like even the Kalam is fallacious in that it breaks the laws of logic in some kind of an invalid way. But you would break things down and we would say, ultimately, we don't know what created all of material reality, or why the parameters are set in a certain way, or what morality really is, ultimately.
Don't get me started on Kalam.
Yeah, I know. Same here.
Yeah,
but the point is that it doesn't... in order for the argument of, we have all these other arguments that outweigh the evidential problem of evil, those arguments have to be really, really conclusive. They're not even close to conclusive.
Especially when you consider the fact that the probability, that your posterior probability should have to be sensitive to the number of inscrutable evils, right? So if you just have, let's just say in all the universe we only have two evils that seem like they're gratuitous, right? They're inscrutable to us. We don't know their reasons why they exist. So let's say in all the universe there's only those two. Yeah, sure, maybe one of them is actually gratuitous, but maybe they both aren't, right? But now if you multiply that to 100, now it's more likely that at least one of them is gratuitous, because all the argument needs is one bit of evil to be gratuitous to show that God does not exist, right? The bigger number you're referencing, the greater the chance that at least one of them is gratuitous. So when you take into consideration animal suffering, holy shit, we have deep time of evolution here. This is a significant problem. This weighs down your probability so severely that it's not at all obvious that even strong theistic arguments could make up for this probabilistic deficit.
There's a couple of interesting points there that all it takes is for me to stub my toe, and that to be gratuitous. Literally, something as seemingly innocuous as that, but it's just a tiny bit of suffering that's gratuitous. and that needs to be answerable by an all-loving God. You know, I walk along, stub my toe. Why? What use is that? So you know, as you say, the only one unit of pain.
Units. We're
going to quantize suffering.
Yeah. Well, I think in proper utilitarian philosophy.
Yeah, you would have to, of course, in that.
Yeah. But
I just think it's funny.
You've given me 2 units of pain. I'm going to give you 3 back. But yeah, what was I going to say? So it's gone. Forget it.
Oh.
Damn it all.
Oh, no, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. So photosynthesis. So the argument that I've put forward before is that something like you know, as you were talking about evolution and the pain and suffering of animals throughout time, but of course, you know, God could easily have made us photosynthesize. All animals photosynthesize. Why do we need to be carnivorous? Why is it necessary for animals to feed off other animals and cause pain and suffering just for mere survival, if you like? And
Absolutely.
Then you get onto the argument, why do we need energy at all? And then you get on, why do we need to be corporeal? Why, you know, and it goes back and back. And in the end, why aren't we just mental sort of entities?
Yep, I think
you're absolutely right.
That was definitely one of the things that I thought of when I was going through my whole little deconversion. One of the other things I kind of wanted to bring up briefly if we mentioned things like evolution and animal suffering and all that other stuff, is just to kind of point out how already looking at what we know scientifically, combined with the evidential problem of evil, we're already completely throwing out the Christian or biblical account of why we have pain and suffering to begin with, and that is normally given in, at least in a Pauline theology, in terms of the fall and the original sin of Adam.
Right.
Whereas if you're a Christian and you say I support evolution, like most professional theologians, at least the philosophically inclined ones, you now have this huge problem that death and pain and suffering did not enter the world when they bit the wrong apple. It was designed that way. They kicked things off, and we went through thousands, millions of years of this kind of a cycle.
The very process that God used to get to cognitively interesting creatures such as ourselves required the pain and suffering prior to our moral decisions, prior to moral decisions that we made when we had our cortexes intact, right?
Right. No,
well, I think this shows a fundamental weakness in Plantinga's sort of approaches to his theodicies, both the logical and evidential. You know, he seems to rely heavily on the evidential theodicies that on terrible science or terrible understandings of science. And to believe in a literal Adam and Eve, and as you say, evil, moral evil comes into the world at the point of the fall, and then, you know, to deny evolution or whatever. I think it just they shouldn't even be taken seriously, and yet they are.
Yes. So I guess one of the things that the points that comes back to me is that we say in terms of a terrible explanation. Oh, sure, you got an answer that's logically possible. But it's just shitty. And the great example here is that they don't want to let go of things like the fall. And so we know from genetics that we didn't have 2 ancestors. We had like 10,000 ancestors of human beings.
Yeah.
And so they don't want to give up the Pauline theology. I mean, that's biblically, in terms of hermeneutics, that's really important to them and their theology. And so you'll see the most unbelievable explanations as to why there was an Adam and Eve. That, well, there were 10,000 Homo sapien style things, but they weren't really human, and then God specially intervened and made 2 of them, Adam and Eve, and then
the spark of the divine.
That's right. That's where the divine image came into and then the fall happened, and our genetics changed. And it's just, when you get into the amount of problems that has, scientifically speaking, it's just laughable.
Well, it makes perfect sense given that God was smoking, as you were saying earlier, right? I mean,
the purple haze of the spirit.
What's interesting is, particularly on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, when it defines a theodicy, it gives 3 sort of things that theodicies have to do. So the first one, I think, John, you've got these as well. The commonsensical views about the world, for example, that there exist other people, that there exists a mind-independent world, that much evil exists. Second one is widely accepted scientific and historical views, for example, evolutionary theory. And third one, intuitively plausible moral principles, for example, generally punishment should not be significantly disproportional to the offence committed. Now, of course, if the theodicy has to pass those 3 things, then planting doesn't even get out, doesn't even get off the ground.
Well, okay, so a theodicy.
Sorry, do you give planting as theodicies at all? Because we haven't actually.
Okay, right. Well, so the free will defense is a response to the logical problem of evil, but theodicies are attempts to identify God's reasons for allowing these apparently gratuitous evils, right? And that's the third option available to the theist when it comes to the evidential problem. So, as I said before, you could first deny that God is the particular way that the argument assumes. You could also say that there are other arguments that more than make up for this deficit, even if you grant that the evidential problem of evil is evidence against God. And then third, you can, as you said, John, you could use theodicies to try and identify the reasons that God allows the evils that occur that are apparently gratuitous to us, but they're inscrutable. Now, of course, the problem with that is that there's so many evils in the world, and there's so many different kinds of evils and sufferings in the world that it's quite the project to go in step by step and identify a reason for every single thing, and not look like you're just making shit up, right?
Right. So I guess one of the things. So maybe we should move on to, I guess, the most popular responses, which is, I think. You almost always hear it's the free will defense. I think that is the most. Actually, no, we didn't touch number 4 yet. Well, before we go on to it, number 4 I think was the soul-making theodicy.
Well, okay, so I was when in talking about I'm listing the options available to the theist under the evidential problem.
Mm-hmm.
Free will would be a possibility for number 3, right? So free will would be to give a reason. It would be to give a theodicy, right?
Right.
So you're saying that, or at least the theist in response to the evidential problem of evil is saying that all those evils are responses, or are because God thinks that libertarian free will is a good thing, and it's so good that it therefore warrants allowing these certain evils. Even if those evils occur, it's okay because they're for some greater good. So, yeah, you're identifying free will with a greater good to justify those things. Problem is that it's not at all clear that libertarian free will is even a coherent concept, or is even scientifically viable, or, I mean, really. And there are other problems. John, why don't you know one of these here?
Well, I was just thinking free will because that was the subject of my first book. So I've done a lot of research on free will, and it's just shed loads of evidence, empirical evidence. I mean, as you say, Justin, it's both philosophically incoherent. We're talking about libertarian free will here, so the generally understood as the ability to do otherwise in a given situation. So I could, in a particular situation like now, I could, in exactly this situation, pick up this glass of wine and sip from it. Or I could rewind, go back, and in that exact same situation, not pick up that glass of wine and not take a sip from it. But given that they're exactly the same situations, what grounds each individual decision? And so the libertarian, there is no logical sense, no causality that really underlines a coherent understanding of free will. But even if you grant that philosophical idea, then you've got all the empirical evidence, which is just humongous. Whereas the only evidence that actually supports libertarian free will is that people feel like they've got it, just like we feel like the world is flat.
Yeah.
But that's not good enough. So I think, without getting into the whole free will thing, I think it's just fundamentally.
Yeah. And of course you also have the issue of whether or not concerns regarding free choice are significant enough to permit people to rape children and to think that that justifies sitting on your hands. Like, are you kidding me? We would never not intervene on somebody beating a child and be like, well, it's his free will, right?
Right.
If that's not an excuse for our non-intervention, then certainly it's not an excuse for God's, who can intervene without any risk to himself, right? So for me to intervene of some guy beating a child or something, I'm going to be putting myself at some risk. So maybe if he's like, he looks like the Incredible Hulk, maybe it's plausible that I might be justified in being like, shit, I don't want to get it. Like, maybe I'll try to go back and get some other people with me, and we can, take him on. But for God, that's not an issue.
You touch on a really good point. Even before whether or not you're going to be hurt by doing it, it is a moral obligation for us. Understood. This is ordinary morality. This is a kind of stuff that we just take as given. That if I see a child over there on the street getting the shit kicked out of it by 6 other adults, right? I am morally, or even one other adult, I'm morally obliged to step. I've got to stop that, and by stopping that, I'm curtailing that man. I'm curtailing his free will. So I'm morally obliged as a human to curtail that man's free will to stop the suffering of the child. We all accept that, and yet how come God is suddenly not morally obliged to curtail the free will of Hitler, for example, without wanting to bring the old Nazis back?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, and so the funny thing is that they to kind of show how implausible that kind of an answer is even further. I mean, just on the idea that I'm not going to stop a beating because I don't want to impinge on the free will of the person doing the beating. The other answer is that on the theistic ethical system, divine command theories, God has no moral obligations. So he has no reason to intervene in any evils whatsoever on their own moral theory. Which, if you can square the idea of a morally perfect being not having any moral obligations whatsoever.
Well, so they would say that while God isn't subject to any duties, he still acts in accordance with them, as in he acts in accordance with his own nature. So he does the good simply because he is the good, but that he's not really obligated to do it. He just does it out of necessity of his own nature.
But the thing is he's not doing it. So that's where I guess the problem, yeah, that's where the problem comes in.
And you make and there's another huge issue, of course, is that what is so good about libertarian free will, right? So well, you can go on if you'd like.
So this for me was a really, really eye-opening thing when thinking about the subject. And so when you look at theistic moral systems, and so there's an answer that could be given to the evidential problem of evil, but there's also moral arguments for God's existence. And so if you take the moral argument and you say that moral goodness is grounded in God's necessary nature, well, then God acts in accordance with his nature. It's a logical contradiction for God to do something evil, right? He literally cannot do it. It's impossible for him.
So it's not at all clear how God could be morally free.
Right. He doesn't have moral free will in this case, at least certainly not moral libertarian free will, which is what's supposed to be so important for us to allow the problem of evil to exist in the first place.
So then the question comes up, is what is so good about libertarian free will such that it could justify God's non-intervention? And usually when theists talk about things that are good in the world, great-making properties, right, these are things that are good in the world, and their truth-making, the truth-makers of those goods are facts about the very nature of God. Now, if you want to say that libertarian free will in humans is a good thing, you need to give some kind of account of the grounding of that. And if you can't, and if God is not libertarian, if he's not free in the libertarian sense, at least when it comes to his moral decisions, then the goodness of libertarian free will in humans is completely groundless on the theistic moral systems, or at least it doesn't seem at all obvious how it could be grounded.
would the theist say back to that? Well, God potentially could do something morally bad, so he could lie. It's just not in his nature. So he has the potential ability.
Right. The problem
Just
with that,
act
though,
along.
is now the problem with that is that you're now saying that God is only contingently morally perfect, and this is a concern about God's being essentially morally perfect, which says that there is no possible world, so there is no potential for God to be doing evil.
See, to me, it almost seems like it begs the question, because the response there that I think Jonathan was alluding to was that God could sin, but he always freely chooses not to, even though it's logically impossible for him to do so. And so it doesn't seem clear to me how you can say God freely chooses not to sin when he literally can't choose otherwise. I don't understand
as
how.
a part of his nature, as an extension
Right.
of his nature, it doesn't
It
seem at
doesn't.
all
It,
obvious how
to
how that's free in any
Yeah,
interesting way.
to call that free, to insist that that is still free,
Yeah.
doesn't it seems to me to be begging the question. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or at least what Plantinga calls morally significant free will, right? Like this libertarian free will.
Right.
It may be free under some alternate conception of like compatibilist kind of free will, but when it comes to morally significant or libertarian free will, it's not at all obvious how this can even be a coherent system.
One quick addition to that, though, there's nothing that states, and so the reason that God would always freely choose to do the good is because of his necessarily good nature. There's nothing that's it's logically coherent that God could have created human beings or whatever to have the same necessarily good nature, so that we would also always freely choose to do the good in any given situation, even though it was logically possible for us to do otherwise. So we could exist in the same sense. There is no logical contradiction that says God could not have created us that way, to have the same sense of moral free will that God has, if he has any.
That's a really interesting point, because that if we're going to go back to the logical problem of evil, I think that actually deconstructs or pulls the carpet out from the logical problem of evil, which states I think there are four different possible worlds you can have. Where God creates automatons, that are just robots that can't do stuff freely, or that he creates the world like we're in now, which is where we are free but we do evil, and then these other ones. And it says that it needs, the logical problem of evil needs there to be a world which God could create where we are all free people but just so happen to do good, right? And that can't happen in the logical problem of evil for the theist, because otherwise God would make that and we'd all be walking around just because there's nothing logically inconsistent with a couple of us just being really good the whole time. It's not logically incoherent, is it?
No. And the issue there, I know Craig responds to this by stating that those worlds are logically possible, but that there could be overriding deficiencies with those worlds and that God finds, and that's why he doesn't do it. Which seems pretty, it seems like a really shitty cop-out in my opinion.
Well, it's this thing. So he was in a debate with Ray Bradley, wasn't he? And Ray Bradley said, look, why can't there be a heaven? Why does there have to be hell at all? He says the world is made up of two subsets of people: the people that freely come to love God and the people that freely reject God. So why don't you just forget the people that freely reject God and build a world or just have this world where people freely love God? And then Craig said, well, in that world, because it's a slightly different situation, not all of them not all of that subset would have freely ended up loving him. So Bradley says, well, take that out and put them in another.
Nonsense. No, here's the thing. That can be avoided by bringing in philosophical zombies to play the role of those who never are saved.
Yeah. So, well, there's lots of things you can say to that. I mean, first of all, you can do that, and you can just say, well, it's not unfeasible. I mean, you can't just assert. And what does unfeasible mean? Does it? There's a funny interplay between logically impossible and unfeasible. But if your creation of the universe is derived from necessary logic anyway, then unfeasible is just an extension of logic.
Right, and it's punting to metaphysics. So you're going out of logical possibility versus what would be conceived as metaphysically possible, I suppose, which is a very murky subject that isn't very well defined, because if you can conceive of something, then theoretically it's metaphysically possible. And I don't see why metaphysical possibility even plays into this in any way whatsoever, because if they're going to define omnipotence in terms of doing anything logically possible, which is what they'll always do.
Well,
okay.
they will admit to having certain caveats on that. I can't think of what they are at the moment, but I recently read a paper about the problems of that very simplistic view of omnipotence. And of course, you get into like those paradoxes of, can God lift the rocks, or can God heat up a burrito so hot that even he can't eat the burrito? You know, so you get into those interesting things.
Well,
yeah, I'd actually side with the theist with those, because I think when you start messing around with semantics and logic like that, I'd actually, if I was a Christian, I would say that God can do only what is logically possible.
Right.
So I would agree there, but then when you're further off down, those are kind of really abstract. But when you start going further down the line, well, God has actually created worlds, and then you're saying, well, God can't do this because it's unfeasible. Well, does that mean it's logically impossible because of the parameters he's created for himself, that it makes it impossible for it? Surely that's just another way of saying it's logically impossible. So I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it just annoys me.
Oh, sure. And it's one of those dodges that's kind of hard to quantify exactly what's wrong with it. And I just always kind of go back, if it's logically possible and you've defined omnipotence that way, you're going to have to start giving more limitations to the definition of omnipotence, which is just going to make the claim look even more ad hoc, and it becomes, in my opinion, less believable.
Justin's philosophical zombies, though, I mean, that's just a brilliant retort. That's fantastic, and it fills that void.
Because then you don't have to worry about, so maybe it's the case. So someone could argue that, some kind of Molinist response where, God knows all true counterfactuals, and so you could say that only in particular circumstances, and maybe those circumstances require these sinners over here that are oppressing the good Christian, and it takes that kind of circumstance in order for them to freely act in a particular way that God wants them to act, to get them on the path to coming into a relationship with them, or something like that, where these kinds of difficult situations, these different contexts of action are required, and maybe those kinds of things require this other set of agents that present these challenges for these people, right? Now the thing is that you could totally allow that and say, all right, but those don't need to be real agents. Those could be philosophical zombies, such that when they die, they're not actually thinking persons. They're just persons acting out as if they're thinking persons.
But here's the retort. Actually, just think about this. Wouldn't the theist just say, well, actually, how do you know the world, all these people that die, that 3-year-old that just got whatever, or the person that got run over on the street across that, who's to say they weren't philosophical zombies?
Well, then they're denying hell. You're going to give up hell. Okay, yeah. That version of this problem of the evidential problem of evil goes away. But now you're giving up different pieces of theology, and okay, I mean if all we achieved was to make Christianity give up some of the more abhorrent doctrines, then I consider that a partial win.
So the philosophical zombie response, I think, is pretty good against a kind of logical problem of the unsaved, right? Because you could have it where it's perfectly feasible for God to just not create that subset of people who never freely choose to accept Him and they go to hell. You could just have God replace those people with philosophical zombies. Therefore, no one ends up in hell, but yet all the free decisions of the good people are still legitimately free. That's a perfectly plausible world, and God, especially given the substance dualism, it's perfectly feasible for God to create philosophical zombies.
See, I would almost go even further. I would state, so if a theist would admit
I love how we're just like, our topic is there's no There's no good like train that's like riding this along. We're just kind of interspersed, but I like it.
There's
It's
no
good.
boundaries.
Yeah, we're not banned by anything now. So the idea would be that if the theist would admit that, let's say, God could have created the universe 5 seconds ago, and all people we'd be created. We're only. It looks like we've been here for millions of years. We have memories of the past, but they're just kind of implanted in our minds, and we just continue on the way we are, and that doesn't diminish our freedom in any way, shape, or form. Then God could have just created everybody into heaven, and He could have created just the elect, the people who would be saved, into
Well,
heaven, as if they had gone through this life, and then you're done.
John. Here's the thing, and it's really interesting. It sort of feeds into it, but actually you can take it a step further back than there. So on the assumption that God knows also, like Justin was saying, on some kind of Molinism, God knows all counterfactuals. He knows everything that would happen in any possible universe by any agent in any situation. If he's got that knowledge, why the frick does he create at all?
Why the frick?
Why is he going to create? Is because by creating, he says, right, I know that the Holocaust is going to happen. I know that this million people are going to get malaria. I know what's going to happen in this world. Like, I know exactly every bit of experience I know. So why create it so that people fulfill those horrible experiences? Why just not sit back with Justin in his creation non-God objects, but you can have a kind of creation in his head. He can just be like, I can imagine that. Yeah, that's good.
And he imagines it so well that all the great-making properties are still instantiated.
Exactly.
Well, I guess one of the other responses that we haven't necessarily it's tied to the free. We spent a lot of time on the free will response, and I think it's important because that is primarily what we'll see.
Absolutely.
We have just disproved God. Then I don't think you realised it.
The idea is that a lot of times you'll hear is that in addition to free will being good in and of itself, it's the idea that in order to have true love, you have to have free will. It has to be freely given. And I would kind of point back to one of the other problems that we had already, which was if God can't sin, God is necessarily loving, then how is free will in any way possibly related to loving anybody? How could those two even coexist? How could one be dependent upon the other?
Well, go back to the whole issue.
I'm not sure I understood that one.
Okay, so generally what I hear, and I think this is I hear this almost more from Catholic apologists than evangelical ones. It's that the reason why free will is so important is that you can't truly love someone unless that love is freely given, unless you can choose to love them.
Oh, so heaven isn't really legitimately loving God. It's not really anything interesting going on there. It's a bunch of automatons.
Right. Or yeah, do you have free will?
God is working towards.
Right, and that's yet another response to the problem of using free will as your get out of jail free card for the problem of evil. But my response there was, if God is necessarily loving and God can't sin, then how is it in any way? How is free will related as a precondition to being able to love something?
So you're looking at God. I mean, we mentioned earlier that God can't have moral freedom. But it's the same if you look at all of God's supposed omni-characteristics. If you say something like, and I actually disagree because I think the word perfection intrinsically makes no sense on its own. You have to be perfect for something. But
you got to grant them their metaphysics, John. Jeez.
Yeah, sorry. Got to grant these guys their stuff and go.
Just to show it the nonsense.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So God is perfect, and God is all-loving. God is omni, whatever. So in any given situation, God is bound by those perfect characteristics. He can't do anything but the most perfect choice. So every choice, which then means that this world in some way is the most perfect choice, either by the outcome or by the parameters with which God built it or something. This is the most perfect choice, and God couldn't have done otherwise. So God has no free will, and so therefore he can't freely love us.
Yeah. All right. So far we've gone through the through 3 of the 4 responses to the evidential problem of evil, and we've also kind of mixed in some responses, some potential problems for logical problems of evil, for logical problems of the unsaved, people that apparently spend time in hell after this mortal coil. Now, the most popular response to the evidential problem of evil is the 4th response that I want to discuss with you guys, and that is it's a response that argues it argues against the main inference in the argument. So the main inference, at least in the argument I presented, it's between premise 1 and 2. So if you recall, premise 1 was that many evils or instances of suffering seem gratuitous, and premise 2 is therefore probably some evils or sufferings are gratuitous. Now, that's a probabilistic inference, and it kind of assumes that we have that our awareness or our abilities to think of possible justifications, it assumes that our conceptual abilities are fairly representative of the kinds of goods and evils that God might want to appeal to in order to allow certain things. So there's a popular response, and this is a response that's all throughout the literature. It's called skeptical theism. Now, skeptical theism is not the position that they're skeptical that God exists or something like that. No, rather, skeptical theism is a response that says that we're not really in a position to know, because of our limited cognitive faculties, we're not in a position to know the goods and the evils and the relationships between these things. We're not really in a position to know that our understanding of those things is actually representative of what is actual, right? And if that's the case, then we can't really place probabilities on it. And if that's the case, then this move from premise 1 to premise 2 is an illegitimate probabilistic move. And in the literature, this has come to be known as the no-see-um inference, right? Like, no-see-um ain't there, right? So that's the kind of inference being used here. So they're saying that. So the skeptical theist, what they say is that given theism, we should not expect to be able to see these reasons for why God allows what He allows.
Why?
Why? Well, because His cognitive capacities are so much greater than ours.
But see, I have a problem with this because I think that we're getting to understand quantum mechanics at the moment. We're getting to understand some of the most mind-boggling stuff that I've got no idea about. Okay.
Sure.
And these are pretty complex things. Now, if I am given cancer by God, or if I'm allowed to get cancer without it being stopped by God, surely it can't be some genius cognitive faculty that I can't access as to why I have cancer. I mean, it seems it's a very logical problem of evil type. Well, it could be blah blah blah, but really?
No. They're not saying that it's merely a possibility. They're saying that given theism,
I know.
This is what we should expect. We should not expect to be able to have a representative knowledge of the possible reasons. So it's not as though they're appealing to mere possibility. In fact, I actually agree with the skeptical theist. I think that given theism, there's no reason why we should expect to be able to see these reasons, unless
God has given reason for all sorts of things in the Bible,
sure,
and has given reason for certain evils in the Bible. You know,
right.
You can derive, and I just think it's complete. It sounds just very, very ad hoc. I think the jump is too big to go from all this evil and suffering, and we can actually tell each other why there's evil and suffering. Do you know what? I know why that bacteria happened. I know, all this kind of stuff. But God, for some reason, is so far above us that
we can't believe you're going to make me be the theistic advocate here, John. That's just so unfair. So like I said, I think that the skeptical theist response, at least if it's phrased in a particular way, can be a problem for the evidential problem of evil. And I think that it's a legitimate view in the sense that if I were to believe in the God of natural theology, then and if I were to believe that the moral argument is a sound argument, then I would say that, there's going to be these various different properties of the universe, and we only know a small portion of these properties. So maybe there's some goods out there that we can't even conceive of that God is acting towards, but that our suffering is necessary in order for him to obtain those. That seems plausible to me if you grant theism. If you grant that the epistemic chasm between man and God is so big such that it warrants that deficiency, then it seems entirely plausible to me. Now the problem, of course, as has been raised by many philosophers, is that when you introduce this kind of skepticism, or rather when you introduce any kind of skepticism when it comes to our ability to know things, the skepticism tends to bleed out quite a bit into other more cherished parts of our epistemic furniture.
Apply this consistently to other areas of theology, and things do not look good for the Christian.
No, not at all.
Any believer, really. No, I guess if I think I know where you're going, and this is basically the idea that if we were to grant that idea, that we can't possibly know what greater goods God has in mind for any individual bit of suffering, then we have similarly no reason to know whether or not we should act to prevent instances of evil or suffering that we observe every day. So
yeah,
this is Stephen Mateson's argument that ordinary morality presupposes atheism, is it not? So the argument goes something like, actually I've got this ready, any suffering is for a greater good. If you see someone suffering, you should leave them be such that the greater good is realized. This makes no sense, it's not ordinarily moral. Therefore, our understanding of God is wrong. God does not exist and morality is underwritten by atheism. So that's it in really, really quick. So anyone that's listening, check out Stephen Mateson's paper on ordinary morality. But basically, it says that if someone's, again, go back to the example of the child being beaten up by an adult over there. So if I don't do anything about that, then God must have some kind of fail-safe that means that child, there's a greater good that comes out of it.
Yeah.
Okay. But if I do step in, I'm actually going to stop that greater good from happening. So
Yeah.
I'm actually morally obliged not to step in. And
No, well, not necessarily. No, I would say that you're not. I don't think he would argue that. I think he would say that our obligation in that sense, or in that position, is completely inscrutable. As in, we're paralyzed, morally speaking. We're not really in a position to know whether we should or shouldn't engage into the issue and to exert ourselves in protecting people from physical harm or something, because we're not aware of the overarching greater goods that are justifying it, and there may be beyond our understanding goods that do justify the child drowning in the pool or something, and so our intervening, as you said, would prevent that greater good from becoming, which would be a problem for us.
Right. No, and it's basically, we don't know. I guess it's moral epistemology. We don't know what's good, or we
Absolutely.
don't know what the greater good is in any given scenario. So I think the idea is that skeptical theism leads to moral paralysis was the title I think I heard of one of the articles.
That was one of the papers. That wasn't Mateson's paper, but absolutely, there's been a slew of papers regarding the problematic nature of skeptical theism and its effects on the rest of beliefs that theists would not want to disregard.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things that I just really like to point out here is that this is something that when you try to follow apologetics and either give a counter or use it to strengthen your faith, you can get an answer to a big issue like the evidential problem of evil. But now it's going to contradict all these other things that aren't really related to the problem of evil directly, but it's going to start making internal contradictions with answers that you have to give for other problems, or contradict other different areas that are inside of your theology.
Absolutely.
The nature of sort of ad hoc rationalizations, which, to be honest, and I don't mean that pejoratively, but quite often they are very ad hoc. Oh, I've got a problem. What could it be? I think that's the whole nature of theodicies, really. That how can it be explained? Oh, just jam in this mystery card or something. But it's making sure they're coherent across all these different theologies or aspects of your theology, and it doesn't work very well. I mean, I've been arguing online just in the last month actually with certain people on the Unbelievable forum. And they say, oh, one classic one was, oh, open theism, open theism, so that's good. So that's what I believe in, because God doesn't have divine foreknowledge, so he can't know all the evils. And then you press them on, actually, well, does it open theism cohere with what you said over there about something else? And it doesn't. And then like it all falls apart. It's just ridiculous.
Yes. Okay, so there's obviously the problem with ad hoc reasoning of introducing these completely off-the-cuff auxiliary hypotheses to kind of connect to our pet theory to save it, these different ideas of what God might be motivated towards. Now, of course, the problem with those kinds of things is that, if some auxiliary hypothesis doesn't have independent justification, then it's ad hoc in the most violent way. But I think that something like skeptical theism, I don't think that is ad hoc, actually. I would say that it seems entirely plausible that given theism, given a God that created the world who knows everything, and given the fact that we are very aware of our cognitive limitations, it seems to follow that we are in no position to make these kinds of assessments, right? At least if morals are conceived of in the way that we're talking about here under theism.
Right. Now, I
disagree with you, Justin, but I know that it's very good because it works for your divine lies argument. Is it?
Well, there is that, but I legitimately think it's a good thing.
Yeah, but I just find it odd that we're given reasons for other things, as I said earlier, and we know so much, and it's suddenly everything that all these evil and suffering that's going on in the world, down to me stubbing my toe and up to cancer and malaria, just suddenly that's beyond our ken. I think that is just too, that's really coincidental. We're suddenly not clever enough to access any reasons why this is happening. However, we're just about understanding quantum tunneling and string theory. Seriously.
Well, okay. So I'm not at all. I'm agnostic as to the strength of the argument regarding moral paralysis. I've not really thought about that issue much. But I think that something like skeptical theism is very plausible given theism. I think it's almost expected. Whether or not that has an effect on our everyday moral inferences, I'm not necessarily buying into that view. Well, but I would say that there is a reductio to skeptical theism that is that Rowe brought up actually in defense of his argument. So in response to the skeptical theist response, in the earliest forms of it, at least, Rowe says, okay, look, that's fine that you can say that, but recognize what this commits you to. It commits you to saying that even if the world were, even if human life was just from its very birth to its death, every single individual was just constant, horrific pain and suffering, that we couldn't really be in a position to say that, well, probably a perfectly good being who created the universe doesn't exist. Like, that seems so incredibly implausible. That kind of reductio, I think, is intuitively and logically very strong.
That would lead into something along the line of like Stephen Law's evil God argument, or great demon, or whatever you want to call it.
It's definitely related, yeah.
It's the same kind of a vein. One of the things I would say, even if we were to accept, say, skeptical theism, the problem there is that we could have been created such that we could understand the reasons. right?
Mm.
And so this kind of
That
would turn
is
back
that is
into
true.
a divine hiddenness argument. And so it's granted we're talking about the evidential problem of evil, but it gets related to other counter-apologetic arguments. So we could very well have been made so that we would understand what the reason was, and yet we're not.
Yeah,
And
and there's almost an intention there that God didn't want us to know, maybe, or at least, by knowing there would be other unwanted conclusions to that scenario. So, yeah, I think that's a good point.
yeah,
Um,
so,
did anyone were we going to mention the heaven theodicy at all? Is that something that's going to
Um,
come up?
as in a compensation kind of
Yeah,
theodicy.
because I have a massive problem with that, and actually,
Well, why don't you go
go
ahead
for
with
it, go for it, brother.
well, it's really common. Actually, not so common in more astute sort of theologians, but certainly your run-of-the-mill theists seem to think that heaven is some kind of justification for evil in the world. So, for example, if a baby dies at childbirth or gets cancer or whatever, then and dies really young, it's fine because actually they're going to have an eternity in heaven. And the whole concept that anything can be justified by an eternity in heaven, I think is really, really problematic. And it is so because heaven is not moral justification, it is compensation. And those two are very different. So, for example,
absolutely.
if I walked out on that street again and I just walked up to someone and punched them full in the face and then got out a wad of cash and then handed them that cash, that doesn't make what I did right. It compensates a person for the harm that I've caused them, but it doesn't make it a morally good act. It doesn't transform the act
Right. It doesn't
into
make it
moral.
permissible, right?
Yes, no,
Yeah.
exactly.
I think that gets into a core issue of what level of responsibility would, given Christianity or theism, what level of responsibility God would have for creating a situation where he knew evil would come about. Because the dodge there is that humanity created the evil. It was our fault. We were the ones who sinned. And the counter argument there is that, well, God created the situation where this would happen. It's kind of like, putting my 9-month-old daughter down, and surround her with a thing of butcher knives. Like, why? I would be held responsible if anything happened to the child in that kind of a thing. Now, especially given skeptical theism, where we can't even know what something, what greater justifications or goods there are for anything. To put us into a situation where we have to make these morally significant choices, how is that in any way justifiable or fair? It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. If you were to look at that kind of a situation, if we're supposed to look at God as a parent figure, then there's a level of responsibility that is associated
Really
with
shitty
that.
parent.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
very shitty parent. Yes.
So there's a paper I read recently that kind of did a fairly thorough survey of Molinism and the current place in the literature that it holds, the different objections to it, and the popular responses to it. And there was and I forget, I wish I could reference this paper right now, but there's a quote that I like from it. For every evil state of affairs that actually occurs, a God armed with middle knowledge appears to be an accomplice. And I like that. I think that that's kind of exactly the point you were just making, is that if he knows that given these circumstances that the creatures will freely act in a particular way, if he knows all of those contingencies, then clearly he's in part guilty here, right?
Oh my goodness, I can't begin to tell you, Justin, the arguments I've had over the last month again about God's moral culpability for actions. Because if God, if we analogize to, I'm a mad scientist, right, and I design these sentient beings that I'm going to create in my lab, and I know 100% in advance that these sentient beings will go out and they will rape and pillage and attack people out in the town. They might do some good as well, but they do a hell of a lot of evil. And I know that in advance. I know that, and I decide to design them anyway. And I create them, and I let them go out and do their thing. Now, if the police come come to the town, they're obviously going to lock those people up, those sentient beings up for doing whatever they do. But I am ultimately responsible for that. I designed and created them so that they would do that, or in such a way
And
that
knowing
they would do
full
that,
well, knowing full well the full breadth of the contingencies involved, right?
It's almost like you
Absolutely.
could. Oh, go ahead, bro.
I was just going to say, I am not just an accomplice. I'm actually the mastermind. I'm literally the Doctor No, the evil sort of cat-stroking supervillain that creates these things and just says go for it.
So this brings us to an interesting question. Actually, we just got on the Twitter feed well, so for those of you who are listening, we should have said this earlier, but if you wanted to submit a question. And we have like what, another 20 minutes or something left in this?
Yeah, about 20.
If you want to submit a question, you can submit those questions to hashtag #CAVirtualBeers, and submit your question there, and hopefully we'll be able to get to it. So Paul S. Jenkins asked us to talk about Stephen Law's evil God objection and the problem of the good, right? So this is a really interesting issue, especially in the context of debates. And for anybody who's seen the Stephen Law versus William Lane Craig debate, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. So Stephen Law's project essentially is to show that, if you present the argument from evil, you're going to have the theist give all these various responses in the form of theodicies or defenses, right? And the problem is, of course, is that every single theodicy that they want to employ against your argument from evil is that none of these arguments say anything about the moral character of such a being. So, in other words, you could use all these same arguments against someone who is arguing for a morally evil God, right? And say, why is all the good in the world? Given that we have this all-evil God, it just doesn't make any sense, right? And you could give these same responses to the evidential argument from the good. And I think that this is a really interesting argument.
Well, the way the
and I'm interested in what you guys think about it.
The way the argument goes is that Stephen Law says what we do to those theodicies for the evil God is we intuitively say, well, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Yes.
And the key to the argument is this move. If we say that's a ridiculous concept of an evil God and these theodicies,
atheists and theists alike think it's ridiculous.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's mirroring, though. It's a complete reflection of the theodicies that you use for an all good God. So if that's ridiculous, then by necessity, so are the theodicies for a good God. So you end up not being able to know whether there's a good God or a bad God. I don't think it particularly makes a statement about whether God exists or not. It's just about there is no way that we can know whether God is evil.
Right.
So I guess this was definitely an argument that when I started getting into all of this philosophy of religion, I kind of got it was kind of cool, whatever. And the more I've learned, especially after investigating like the moral argument and things like this, and you come back to it, you just have this newfound appreciation for just how really smart this argument is.
Yeah.
And so Jonathan hit the nail on the head, and so it's really a reductio ad absurdum for the theodicies that they give to explain away the evidential problem of evil. And so we say that if there was if we were to turn theology on its head and say there was a perfectly evil being, and so instead of good being the privation of evil or the absence of blah, blah, if evil was the absence of good, which is a favored response of a lot of theists, we would just do the opposite and say good is the absence of evil.
Right.
An absolutely evil being who's necessarily grounds the nature of evil.
Right. So it is evil itself that has positive ontological status.
Yeah.
And it is the good that is just merely a privation of it. It is the dark to the light. It is the shadow to the tree.
And if you were to say, it works just as well for a divine command theory, so you would just state that to do good would be the opposite of the commands of a perfectly evil being. You could get both. And so we would have, in this kind of a scenario, if we existed in the universe as it is now, we would look at this and say, well, why is there all this good stuff. Look at the children playing. Look at the birds. Look at nature, the waterfalls, all of this great stuff. Why would such an evil being create all of this good stuff?
Yeah, like, he's so damn good. Why is he doing this?
You know, there's a lot of good, but there's also a lot of evil, and the problem flips. And so the answer there is that it's absurd. You would not really accept the inverse explanation as to why all of this good stuff exists, so that a greater evil could. We can't understand the possible maximal evils that are there, so that the good has to be there to bring about these greater evils, and we would pretty much just reject this out of hand. And I think the response that Craig brought up in that debate was that we have to be agnostic about whether or not God is good or evil in terms of our experience of the world as it is. And the only justification that he has for stating that God is necessarily good is his moral argument, which is eventually, boil it all the way down, relies on a brute moral fact that God is the standard of goodness. That's it. It's just an assertion. That's what we define God to be. And there's no reason that any person, atheist or theist alike, because there are plenty of theists, Christians even, like Richard Swinburne, who reject that kind of divine command ethic.
So you could have someone you could have some some tribe in the Amazon that has never contacted anybody, like, suddenly thrust himself into the popular culture and come up with the reverse of Anselm and say necessarily there exists an evil God, and that's just what we should call God. And so what would Craig say to such a person? Like, he would seem to have no ammo whatsoever if we're talking about just the definition of a God at this point.
Yeah, right. What Stephen Law says as well is that those so, for example, Craig relies heavily, as I said earlier, on the internal witness of the Holy Spirit, and you can just say, well, that's evil God messing with your head, and of course Craig has no epistemological method to be able to differentiate between an evil God messing with his head and a good God being.
I'd be careful. I'd be careful there, because once you go that route, epistemologically speaking, any position really gets undermined. It's almost like saying your senses aren't reliable, and how do you that's just an epistemological hole you can't get out of.
Well, I think it's slightly nuanced there. I see where you're going with that, and of course this sort of correspondence theory of truth, that actually we're not just brains in a vat, blah blah blah, but it's slightly more than just an intuition. I mean, and yet it isn't. You know, God is fundamentally hidden, and so we rely on some really, really quite interpretable and dodgy evidence to support, you know, that Craig has had internal witness of the Holy Spirit, and yet, you know, anyone in another religion has their witnesses are false, and, you know, it's highly spurious anyway. So I think, you know, considering we reject God out of hand anyway, you know, not out of hand, we reject it after heavy thinking and analysis. But you know, I don't think it's a problem to say, well, how prove to me your God's not evil.
That is, at least in my take on it, that is the response to any kind of a religious experience argument. That you can come up with, internal witness of the Holy Spirit or whatever, it's just a pluralism objection. There are, and this works really well. Especially if the apologist you're dealing with tries to use the Plantinga justified true belief or warranted Christian belief epistemology, whereas they have to admit that in this other doxatic community, like for, say, Hindus or Muslims or whatever, that they have their own set of properly basic beliefs in their God Allah or their God Krishna or whatever, and they have this inner witness of their God.
You're incorrect. You just don't understand that God has independent reasons for being really geographically specific when it comes to his imposing of his proper basicality upon people.
I'm not even going geographic. That's a whole separate argument.
Oh, okay.
Personally, I believe there is just one true God that gives all these messages out, and they're all true. I mean, postmodernism rules.
Right. Well, I mean, that's basically the idea, and I guess the only response I ever saw to the pluralism objection from a Christian specifically was that there are Christian theism supports the idea that there are other spirits, there are evil spirits that could have created the miracles of Joseph Smith or Sati Sai Baba in India, and that they're just false things from the devil. In which case, you just throw that argument right back at the Christian, and how do you know that the devils of Hinduism aren't doing that for your inner witness of the Holy Spirit?
John, you can't go around saying things like that, because Justin and I have ample foreheads with which to, we can surely show that that's just insane.
You had to bring attention to that, didn't you? Where are my 2 she-bears when I need them? Damn it!
Nice.
Anyways.
Yeah. I don't know. I think we might have beaten this one to the ground, or is there anything else that you guys would like to bring up?
Well, I would like to at least give a kind of a cursory explanation of the divine lies argument, if you guys wouldn't mind.
God, it took you bloody time, mate. I was expecting that about an hour ago.
Go for it.
All right. So, okay. So, as we were talking about earlier, there are problems with skeptical theism in the sense that the skepticism seems to bleed, and there seems to be no way of having a principled reason to stop this bleeding, right? In that it infects many places where the theist would not want it to be. So, and again, we were saying it earlier that the skeptical theist response is a very popular response to the evidential problem of evil. Nearly every time I use this argument, I get something like skeptical theism, and once you have them clarify it and they get to a point where it's sufficient to undermine the evidential argument, that is the kind of gold point you need to start at. Now, here's an argument that that was put forth by Eric Wielenberg in a paper, Skeptical Theism and Divine Lies. In that paper, he argues that if we're not in a position to know, to place probabilities on whether or not God has morally justifiable reasons for allowing things that seem to us to be clearly gratuitously evil, then it's also the case that we're not in a position to know whether or not God might have morally sufficient reasons beyond our understanding to lie to us in Scripture. Now, if that is the case, then there's obviously a big problem that follows, which is that Christians can't know any of the claims in the Bible as long as the Bible is the only place that they are justified in holding those claims, right?
Surely that can be extended, because you're saying that we can't know that God's lying to us in the Bible, but actually you can't know that God's not lying to you in any kind of evidence that is put forward, or even in the internal witness of the Holy Spirit. You can't.
Well, here's what I would say. Here, I would not extend the argument that far. So because I think that we can have independent reasons, and we can kind of so I think we can have independent reasons for thinking other things that have justification external to the Bible, maybe scientific claims. Now you could argue perhaps God might have reason to get into your mind and mess around like an evil demon or something like that, but I don't think that the argument needs to go that far. Because the argument, all it's doing is holding them to consistency and saying that the very principles you adopt for your reasons of skeptical theism, in order to avoid the evidential problem of evil as a matter of proper consistency, you also need to say the same thing about God and the potential for lying in the Bible. Now, there's a number of responses to this, of course, one of them being that, because God is morally perfect, that to lie is to logically contradict his moral nature. Now, there's two responses to this, I think, that should clearly correct this clear violation of theistic logic. Is to say that, first of all, biblically speaking, you have no basis whatsoever to say that lying would logically contradict God's nature. And I'm not assuming inerrancy here whatsoever. I'm assuming just a general view of what the Bible seems to present God as. God has no problem whatsoever lying to his people for some greater good. That's apparent.
You guys did a Reasonable Doubts podcast on did God lie or does God lie? And that had some really interesting sort of examples of, if not open lying from God's point of view, but then lying by proxy or deception in some way. So,
right. The other problem with this kind of response of saying, that that for God to lie is to logically contradict himself. The other problem is that that's not at all clear, because where are you getting this information that being morally perfect entails always telling the truth? That is not at all obvious. So there's a number of things that we could think of that could be morally justifiable lies, right? Lying in order for some. Right. Those like little white lies. If you're hiding Jews in your basement and the Nazis come to your door, I'm sorry, but I'm going to lie. And if you're going to tell me that I'm wrong in lying about that, then fuck you, right? I mean, that's absurd.
Hello, Hans. There's no gefilte fish here. No, sorry.
It's the old inquiring murderer, and that's the one of the criticisms to Kant's categorical imperatives. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and also you get one of my favorite movies, Life is Beautiful, right? The father lies to his son the entire movie, in order that his son might have a joyful childhood. It's a beautiful movie, and no one watching that film is thinking that's pretty fucked up that guy's lying to him. Like that's ridiculous.
Well,
anyone that perpetuates the Santa Claus myth is by default a lying bastard.
Exactly. You could no longer justify these things.
So the one thing I would point out that makes it a bit consistent in terms of specifically the Bible, especially when you deal with more liberal Christians who want to talk about things like hermeneutics as to why the genocides were put in the Bible, or why the slavery was allowed and you could beat your slave as long as they didn't die and could get up within 3 days, that it's morally fine. Or things like Jesus literally ascending into heaven, which he would just end up in outer space. It just doesn't seem to make sense. And you hear things like, well, that's God is making an analogy that is culturally relevant to those people and their understanding at the time, or he's making it so that they could understand something. And
sure.
And that just brings out the whole kind of a problem with your entire approach to hermeneutics. So
hermeneutics, by the way.
Hermeneutics. Yeah.
All right, fine. I'm not even gonna bother trying.
I'm sorry that we knew to correct you.
That's okay. I have a skeptical response as to whether or not pronunciation is actually valid.
Well, yeah, nice. I like it. Yeah.
There we go. But
we understood what you were saying, so but you succeeded.
Right. No, and so the idea would be that we already have all of these problems in terms of things in the Bible contradicting what we a perfect being theology. If you look at the Bible, you don't come anywhere near Anselm's perfect being. So to try and square that with the stories we have in the Bible, you already have a number of problems anyway. And if you embrace skeptical theism, well, now that's another problem where you really can't know if it was truly moral. It was a moral imperative to kill the babies of the Amalekites, and was it Joshua 15 or whatever else it was?
The Amalekites, 1 Samuel 15.
Okay.
This is Justin's favorite.
Sorry, I had too much fun with that debate. Sorry.
No, I think that's one of the. I think if you're going to go at it, that's one of the three major areas in the Bible to go after him on.
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing about the evidential problem of evil is that you've got to pick the worst case scenarios to test out whether theodicies work or the problem of evil works. The same with the Bible. You've got to deal with the worst things in there in order to see whether your theories or your defenses or theodicies are robust or not. So when we're talking, and I don't think actually we've dealt enough with natural evil tonight, because I think you know, when you've got a tsunami killing 240,000 people, when you've got all these kind of, you know, really terrible natural evils.
Well, that's the Bill Cosby defense. Don't you know about the Bill Cosby defense? I'd take you in this world, I'd take you out.
I thought it involved a cosmic Jello pudding pop. But
No,
okay.
no. I brought you in this world, I'd take you out. That's the Bill Cosby defense there. Or theodicy, I should say.
Okay, that's beautifully put, by the way.
No, it wasn't.
And I do have a problem with that as well. Yeah, with the theodicy. I don't even know if it is a theodicy. It's just it seems like a two fingers up.
It's just a bald assertion.
It's just like the claim that God has the right to take life. You know, He gives life, He takes life. And you think, well, is that any kind of just, you know, my cousin died at the age of 3 the other day. Ah, yeah, but God can do what He likes. He's got that right. Okay, that's nice. That makes it morally justified. Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Crazy.
unfortunately, I think we have to call it here. This is definitely a ton of fun. I was really looking forward to getting this hangout going, so maybe we could do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
Definitely a ton of fun, guys. Hopefully we've answered a lot of questions, or at least entertained some people for a good hour and a half.
We've asked a lot more questions, I think, than we've answered. So,
That's probably true. Hey, John, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, really appreciate it, John. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I'm just thrilled to have you guys on here. Thank you for coming.
See you guys.
All right, have a good one, guys. Bye.